Welcome to the 61st episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks, and what will be the penultimate episode of Season 2. At the end of what feels a particularly long and grueling year of international law, albeit not one without some slender rays of hope, it's finally time for the full cast end-of-year drinks. I'm your host, Douglas Guilfoyle, Professor of International Law and Security at UNSW Canberra. Joining me to give 2025 its report card and to decide who gets coal in their stockings this Yuletide is the complete Called to the Bar team. Associate Professor Tamsin Paige of Deakin Law School, Associate Professor Ntina Tzouvala of UNSW Sydney, Dr. Juliette McIntyre, Senior Lecturer in Law at the institution formerly known as the University of South Australia and now part of the merged Adelaide University, although apparently that's actually happening in a few weeks and hasn't quite happened yet, and Associate Professor Imogen Saunders, Director of the Centre for International and Public Law at the ANU College of Law. But before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. And before we get down to complaining about how exhausted we all are, although in fairness we began that before the recording started, our traditional first question. Everyone, what are your drinks? I'm going to go across the screen in the order I can see people. Imogen.
I have a glass of a very nice rosé. It's a Bird in Hand Pinot Noir rosé. I'm not a big red wine drinker. I like red wine, but red wine doesn't really like me. So rosé is sort of my compromise. And for Tuesday night, it's very nice indeed.
I hear you on the perils of red wine and middle age. My appetite for, yes, red wine is considerably larger than its benevolence towards me. Dina.
So it's 5 p.m. We should also say that. And normally I don't drink.
Anyway.
Normally I don't drink so early, but I've made myself a whiskey and coconut water thing. Which is really nice and summery. I got the idea, like, apparently it's a big thing in Brazil. And when first the Brazilian friend told me about it, I was a bit of a hater, but it is actually delightful for a hot climate. So it's a lot of ice, coconut water, and whiskey.
What sort of whiskey?
It's a Japanese whiskey, but I couldn't tell you which one. I just remember, yes.
Japanese whiskeys.
The Japanese whiskeys are the bomb.
They are, aren't they? Oh my God.
It's really nice. It's really smooth.
Tamsin.
So I broke out some tea that was actually a gift from a former guest of the podcast, Juliette Santos de Cavallo. When I saw her, it's a blend put together in a Dutch coffee and tea house called I think Roma Coffee is the people who put together the blend. It's their Well-Start blend, which is white tea, green tea, blackberry leaf, corn flour, and dried citrus, papaya, and pear. It's pretty tasty. I'm digging it.
That's excellent. Juliette.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to take this opportunity to do an unpaid promotion for a little group called What's a Cowie Brewing Company down at the lovely Yorke Peninsula in South Australia. I discovered this when I was on holiday recently, and it is yuzu, lime, and lemon flavored vodka seltzer. It tastes like a lemonade icy pole. It's probably one of the most delicious drinks I've ever had in my life. And you can't even really find it in like any beverage shops around Adelaide. Like it's so tiny and new. So if you find it, get it. It's amazing.
I love like our pivot to small business promoters. I am really supportive.
Well, speaking of that, I'm having a thank you. Just delivered. The rest of the can has just been delivered by my 13-year-old wine steward.
Does he have his RSA, Doug?
No, he does not have a responsible service of alcohol certificate. So there's a violation of a child labour.
So there's irresponsible service of alcohol going on, and we approve.
Sometimes this household's quite 70s. So yes, this is a Barley Griffin Canberra Pale Ale from my local, not exactly microbrewery, mini brewery, Bent Spoke Brewing Company. And it's delicious and also fits very well with the summery drinks theme. All right. So to kick off, I think we can agree that 2025 was, amongst many other things, the year of the advisory opinion. From the ICJ, we've seen the UNRWA AO, the obligations of Israel in relation to the presence and activities of the United Nations, other international organizations, and third states in and in relation to the occupied Palestinian territory. ICJ loves a zinger of a title. And the ICJ's blockbuster obligations of states in respect of climate change. Similarly, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights gave us advisory opinion OC-32/25 on the human rights obligations of states in the context of the climate emergency. This follows hot on the heels of 2024's ICJ advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and ITLOS's response to the request for an advisory opinion submitted by the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law. So what are we to make of all this activity? Have small states now made advisory opinions an ordinary tool of legal statecraft? Or is this the last gasp of a liberal vision of international law? And beyond the content of the opinions, what do they mean for international relations and the institutional roles of the tribunals issuing them? Tamsin, I think I saw your hand first.
Yes, because I want to raise an objection to the fact that the occupied Palestinian territories was over a year ago. Like that actually just seems like violence, noting that that was not this year, because I completely thought it was this year, and now I am very much shook.
Oh God, the same. Like so, this is, so how historians talk of the long 19th century that didn't finish until beginning of the First World War. I conversely think we're living in the long 2025 where it includes a lot of 2024 because I refuse to acknowledge that all of those things were over a year ago.
We are living in season 6 of 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's depressingly accurate.
And the writing's getting terrible. Like they need to wrap it up, honestly.
Yeah. Like cancel this show.
We've got the dodgy showrunner now. The good one's gone and
yeah. So on the note of the advisory opinions, I think that it is both statecraft from small states, but also it's statecraft from small states using what tools they have against what we're seeing as a decline of centralized diplomacy. So it's a use of these tools, but we're seeing these tools getting used in response to a decline of the value of centralized diplomatic forums like the UN, like all of these other forums like WTO and what have you. We're seeing a turn to what tools are available when you don't have a giant military and the people with giant militaries are ignoring international law. Or the people with the backing of those with giant militaries are ignoring international law or saying that we just dig up the coal and gas, and sell it, we don't burn it. That's not our responsibility, much like drug dealers. Just sell the product and don't force anyone to use it, which, looking at you, Australia, we're seeing this level of absolute disregard for any sort of global community and centralized diplomacy as a tool of making the world less shit. And so I think smaller states are using what tools are in their arsenal, and one of those tools is an advisory opinion. So the answer is yes. I suppose it'd be how I'm at.
It's a glass half full answer. Like it's in some ways, it's great to see small states using the tools they've got, but it's unfortunate about the circumstances.
Yeah. And in answer to your last question on what does it mean for international relations and blah, 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 it means shit's fucked, yo. Shit's really fucked.
If this is what we've got to do. Imogen?
Yeah, thanks. I actually have a slightly more optimistic picture, especially in regard to the ICJ.
Optimism could be great.
Especially in regard to the ICJ AOs, because I was thinking about this, and the thing is, of course, the General Assembly isn't the only body that can request an advisory opinion from the ICJ. But for the big three that we talked about, they all came from the General Assembly. And for the climate change AO, it was by consensus. And so I think you actually do see some success of that large-scale diplomacy, because to get those AOs in the first place, you had to have big politicking and big agreeing at the General Assembly. So I don't think it's a complete failure of the international system in that way. In fact, I think it's actually a success of the smaller states in being able to leverage the power that they have, some very clever diplomacy in terms of getting states on side, being able to get being able to get OPEC to at least not vote no to a climate change advisory opinion, I think is pretty good. But I think the other thing that you are seeing, again, in the ICJ context is I wouldn't say the death, but the decline of contentious jurisdiction on anything but an ad hoc basis. And I think particularly, the UK has said for a very long time, look, we're the only P5 member who accepts compulsory jurisdiction. We're the only P5 member who has an optional declaration. But their amendments now that they won't accept disputes unless they're given 6 months notice of the dispute, and that they can then amend their optional clause declaration at any point with no notice provision, essentially means they don't accept the compulsory jurisdiction anymore. So I think it is slightly more optimistic. It's good diplomacy using the General Assembly to get resolutions that get the advisory opinion, but it's a problem in terms of cutting off avenues to contentious jurisdiction cases.
Juliette, then Dina. And of course, we're talking advisory opinions. We have to hear from the procedure goblin herself.
Well, yeah, so I'm going to come at it sort of from the perspective of the court, I suppose, if you will, because Tamar and I talked about this briefly in our episode a few weeks ago. And it's not that in general this increase of advisory opinions is a bad thing per se. I think it does represent what you've said, Imogen, that there's this increase in a certain level of cooperation across a broad range of states. But it also, as Tamsin pointed out, represents this failure of other institutions to do their job and then this need to rely on the court. And so I think from the court's perspective, their problem is that they are swamped, right? Like this has been the year of the advisory opinion. And some of those advisory opinions perhaps weren't as necessary as they, maybe appear to be. I'm talking in particular about the UNRWA one. Now, look, it was a perfectly good advisory opinion. The court's statements are all very logical. It's well crafted, all of these things. Did we really need an advisory opinion to articulate those rather obvious legal premises? Though I don't know that we did. The court took the opportunity to make a few extra statements that were good and important. But realistically, this is a huge amount of work and resources and energy from the court. And even Judge Tlati was like, at the end of that, he goes, we're just a court at the end of the day. There's only so much we can do in this context. You are using us to replace the political organs of the United Nations due to their failures on this front. We can't replace them. That this will not do what you want it to do. We will state the law as we are, as you have asked us to do and as we are capable of doing. But the law is clear a lot of the time. The problem is one of enforcement. And so I do wonder, if this is going to be a technique that is used on the regular going forward, that the court is going to get kind of frustrated because they do have a very busy docket. While there has been, as Imogen pointed out, this decrease potentially in cases that are based on, say, the optional clause. The cases are more ad hoc, sure, but that doesn't mean there's not still a lot of them. Like we're pushing 30. And so I think the court is it doesn't want to get used in this way necessarily. So yeah, that would be my sort of flag of warning, perhaps, that this has been a thing. Maybe it should become a regular thing.
Dina.
Yeah, so I think I'm also unsurprisingly on the slightly more pessimistic side. I agree with Tamsin's point about I think advisory opinions, especially I would say the climate ones, are what happens when multilateral treaty negotiation falters, right? And that has been very explicit on behalf of small Pacific states, right? They want to use this advisory opinion to bring everyone back on the table. And I think there is something particularly enraging about states like Australia that are responsible for the multilateral negotiations stalling, then saying, oh, adjudication is not a good way of dealing with this. And it's like, we know. And but you can't be the one who's responsible for the problem and then acknowledge and then invoke the problem, right? Yeah, because in a sense, if we want to be very pragmatic, for example, about climate change, we are way past the point of general principles, right? We are at the point where we need concrete action. I would say that even that is way past the point. And to the extent that international law plays this role in this action, we need very concrete and granular commitments, both about emissions, but about things like technology transfer, human rights obligations, financing from big emitters, etc. So in that respect, yeah, but at the same time, as with Tamsin, I think we shouldn't obviously blame those who use the very few means at their disposal. So I don't think, when you're with your back against the wall, you just fight with what you have. The slightly perhaps even more pessimistic version would be, to what extent, even from some smaller states, or let's say less powerful states, seeking advisory opinions or even initiating contentious cases can be a stand-in for more meaningful action. So, for example, others have noted that before me, but until extremely recently, South Africa was maintaining full and normal economic relationships with the state that it was accusing of genocide at the ICJ, right? Only extremely recently did South Africa commit to some, for example, export bans of weapons to Israel, right? So there is, I think, a possibility. The worst case scenario is not the ineffective, is using litigation either in the contentious or in the advisory opinion form as a replacement for perhaps less visible but a more meaningful action. I don't think this has been the case across the board, but I do think it has been the case in many examples. And we see also states making very good and very radical submissions in ICJ proceedings. And then when the time comes to walk the walk, not do so. And I'm thinking, for example, here, the typical example would be China's oral submissions in the Palestine advisory opinion of last year, that, it was the most third worldist submission that, not oral, not written, oral submission that any state made. And at the same time, China maintains full and normal diplomatic and especially economic relations with Israel, including Chinese companies doing business in the West Bank and building settlement roads in the West Bank, while at the same time, the very radical oral pleadings of its council circulating in Al Jazeera as the sort of like third worldist ally. So I think in some cases it can be actively, and especially from a state, like China, but I would say to an extent even South Africa, amongst the states of the global South, South Africa is not the poorest or the weakest. I think sometimes it cannot replace meaningful action.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think two themes I'd just like to pull on there briefly before we move on. One, the resort to courts and litigation is what you get when other processes fail. In a sense, this shouldn't surprise us, right? This is what happens in the domestic sphere as well. So if an employer says, well, it would all be far more constructive if we could resolve this in-house rather than be before a court, well, the answer is, as we put it, well, then maybe you should have resolved it in-house before your employees had to take you to court. So in one sense, that's not particularly different and doesn't necessarily particularly point to failures of law. This is just when law gets invoked. No one calls for a lawyer when things are going well. Also, just to push back very slightly on Dina's last point, but perhaps with reference to the South African example, and I'll go into this in more detail in part of our later discussion, but I think there may also be an element where states may say things as a legal argument first, because that's just what it's politic to say in that moment, but then progressively become captured by their own logic and their behaviour winds up moving in that direction. And I do wonder if the South African case is an example of where it was easier to say the right thing first and then, as it were, becomes captured by its own logic and has to move increasingly in that direction. But I think we'll come back to that kind of issue under other heads of discussion. But moving on, because we have a lot to cover, because there was indeed a lot of 2025. What's our scorecard for 2025, gang? Was it a good year for international law, with landmark legal rulings on the environment and a former head of state delivered to the International Criminal Court? Or are we seeing a system in terminal decline, with atrocities in Gaza, Russia's continued aggression in Ukraine, and US unilateralism completing the final erosion of the current system's legitimacy? An erosion that, I'll note, almost certainly began either with the second war in Iraq of 2003 or indeed perhaps in Kosovo in 1999. Right, who would like to go first on this one? Apparently the consensus is we're giving letter grades. Imogen.
I'm happy to go first, and I think I'm going to give it a C minus, a passing grade, but not by much. And I should say, I think the only reason I'm giving it a passing grade is it's much better, I think, than sort of the 3 years previous. So just on the basis of where I think on a slightly upward trajectory, although there is still illegal use of force, although there are still wars going on, I think we're seeing more international censure, more international, not action per se, but at least movements towards action. So my C minus could do better, but at least it's not as bad as it was.
Passably optimistic. Juliette?
So I struggled with this. I'm struggling to give it a letter grade because I really think it depends on your perspective, right? So if you're a government lawyer, you might want to give it a distinction or a B plus or even an A minus, right? Because there's plenty of things that have been going on that seem pretty good. And certainly you will be very busy. You know, if you're an Australian government lawyer, you're going to be working on the MH17 case, and Australia and the Netherlands, you know, they were successful at the ICAO Council, and now there's going to be an appeal to the ICJ. There's the CEDAW case, which of course is a great call from several states to, you know, try and hold the Taliban to account for its treatment of women. And while we can look at that in a practical sense, it's probably not going to do much, you know, at least these issues are getting recognized, put on the table, and you're going to be busy, 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 right? So, or if you're doing not tariffs type trade, but if you're doing, you know, investment dispute stuff, you know, you're always going to be busy. So, you know, if you're looking at it from that point of view, you'd be like, yeah, look, it's fine. It's working well. We're having some wins, you know, we're applying the law. It's great. But then I think if you're, you know, a human rights lawyer, you're going to be like D minus, fucking atrocious, right? Like just absolute, you know, ongoing horrific atrocities in several parts of the world. And a point that I might return to later as well, this things being done which perhaps were not considered possible in previous years, right? Let's just bomb Qatar because we feel like it. Let's just strike some people in the Caribbean and have no feelings about that. If we have any feelings, our feelings are very positive about that. Some of these activities, I think, feel a little bit unprecedented and a little bit horrifying. And so, yeah, that's kind of my point. I think it depends on where you're looking at it from as to whether you're going to give it a good grade this year or a bad grade.
And just on that, you know, that passing point about randomly blowing stuff up in the Caribbean, there's that element of, yes, there's been some pushback from the United States establishment going, actually, this is a line too far, and we need to remind the US military of the duty to disobey illegal orders. And then you have an administration threatening to prosecute people who used to be service personnel under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for making those statements, which, as at least one person has put it, is threatening to prosecute people under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for repeating something it actually says, that there is a duty to disobey illegal orders. So there's this sort of Ouroboros kind of snake eating itself of, yay for the law, oh no. Anyway, who wants to go next?
I think the consensus was that I was going next. And look, I'm torn between a D- and an F, mostly because my stuff focuses on either predominantly on security law, and we have literally had, governments just randomly bombing Iran, and then other governments coming out and saying, well, we support that. I'm like, so you support aggression? We didn't say that, but we support the bombing of Iran. And I'm like, so you support aggression? You fucking idiots. We had the continuation of genocide in Gaza now turned into colonialism and a real estate deal. We have the decision to try and bully Ukraine into open surrender to Russia on Putin's word that he won't reinvade the new boundary lines later, which makes no sense. We have the US just existing in its current state beyond like the Caribbean strikes on boats, which aren't even war crimes. For everyone who says that they're war crimes, please remember that requires there to be a fucking war. Tardich, question of fact. Armed conflict has to exist for war crimes to exist. No armed conflict exists. It is a government policy though, so I'll go give you crimes against humanity on top of murder. We have that. We have, as you said, the president of the US retweeting suggestions to hang people for treason for suggesting that people should ignore illegal orders. We then, the Cedar case, I actually don't think is a good case. I think it's a necessary case, but it's not a good case because it should never have got here. This is a failure of a 20-year invasion, which is then we're going to try and fix by taking some people to court. Get fucked. I mean, that's just shit. Do fucking better. Like, all of this, it's just the tariff nonsense. All of it. It's just, I got nothing here beyond this is shit and everyone needs to do fucking better.
You know you're getting a frank report card when Dr. Paige is in the house. Associate Professor Paige, indeed. Dina.
So, yeah, I'm like between F and Z and somewhere between there. But for slightly different reasons.
Can I then amend if we're about to go below F?
How far down can we go?
Yeah, I'm on board with below F if that's allowed.
For those who can't see the Zoom call, I nearly choked.
For slightly different reasons to the reasons that people mentioned so far, which is, I personally think there was a lot of killing when international law was at its best, right? Or at its height. Like, international law is intensely relaxed about mass killing. What I do think, though, is different is the glaring absence of international legal justifications, right? Because for me, international law is very much a practice of structured argument, right? It's not about what people do, it's about how they justify it in argument. And to continue, for example, with the example of the murders in the Caribbean, what is remarkable is how little international legal justifications the US has provided. Occasionally they will say defense, but like, it's not like they have sent any letters to the Security Council saying, which historically the US has been doing after Nicaragua, right? So for me, there is a marked decline in how states use the language of international law to justify their actions, and how other states use the language of international law either to contest what third states are doing or to try to find some sort of communication. We will talk about that later, but to me, it was a remarkable moment when the US not just imposed the tariffs. Again, states have been doing things against WTO law for forever. But the fact that the US didn't justify it in reference to the WTO law, and that the only state that has brought to date a case in front of the WTO is China, and no one else, including states that have been champions of the WTO or the European Union, Australia, Canada, that everyone went and negotiated these informal deals. To me, that's a real sign of very serious decline that we didn't see even in the moments that you mentioned, especially in 2003. I think what was remarkable was that the US put forward so many justifications of what they were doing being legal. We don't have to believe them, and I don't think we do, but they were really holding on to the language, right? So for me, what happened this year is remarkable, and it is different to other moments of a real world crisis.
I'm going to jump in here.
Please.
And not to be, the Pollyanna apologist for international law here, but I think I'd give the US a Z, sure. But I think, everything the US is doing doesn't encompass the world. And I know that's not what you were saying, Dina, at all. But I do think we have these big examples of the US and Trump just being so outlandish. And the WTO is broken. It has been for years. I do think there is some, and maybe it's just the way I can get through the day and get through my discipline and still face my students and tell them a positive story. I think sometimes some of the reason maybe international law as a whole isn't a Z is when you look at the smaller actors and you look at what, Pacific states have been able to do this year. You look at what states who aren't dominant powers or aren't traditional players in international law are stepping in and stepping up. And that, for me, is, I guess, the good side of the story. Yes, the big powers are being pretty shit, even if it's not US levels, there are other countries doing very lukewarm defences of international law. The UK is certainly not doing great stuff in this area, but there is maybe room for other players to step in, and I think that's a good thing. So
I'm the one who hasn't offered a grade yet, and just sort of fusing those last two comments, Dina's critique is particularly devastating for me because the entire thesis of my current scholarship is about the power of international law as a language of justification, critique, and a mechanism for smaller actors to try and hold larger actors to some form of account. So Imogen's rehabilitated a little touch of my hope with her last comment. Now, the nuance I'm going to offer on my grade is that my high school, the private boys' school to which I was sent, had a letter and number grade, and the number was for effort and went from 1 for excellent through to 5 simply not trying. So I'm going to give international law overall a C4, like bare pass, but really there's room for a lot more effort here.
Are we intending to invoke the explosion with that grade?
Only incidentally. But Die Hard is a Christmas movie. All right, so look, as a follow-up to that last round, what do we think 2025 will be remembered as the year of? If it's a turning point, from what are we turning and towards what? So by way of opening example, I'm going to repeat my claim of this time last year that we may be seeing a turn from universal institutions, the UN, the WTO, the ICC. Well, we can put a question mark beside the ICC, the extent to which it's universal, but it certainly has universalist aspirations, towards minilateralism. And we can think in this context of, AUKUS, the Quad, and the very awkwardly named Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think trade is in there in some, I know it's a trade agreement, but I'm sure I've heard the word trade in its name before. But anyway, the CPTPP. How does anyone in trade get through that? Anyway, and also regionalism, especially I think we're going to see, human rights and climate questions addressed more at the regional level. But other takes. Is it a turning point? From what to what? Juliette?
So I wanted to go first here because when Dina was talking, it gave me my answer, except I don't have a pithy word for it. But I think this is the year of acting first and thinking later. And that, by what I mean, is we have seen, I think, often a lack of legal justification for these things. Again, I think the Qatar bombing is a good example of this. A really extreme, seemingly spontaneous act to just send some bombs. And that went really wrong. And it was, Netanyahu issued a formal apology to Qatar for that afterwards. So for all of the sort of at the time, oh, we can totally do this, it's fine, justify, yeah, no worries. They did walk it back quite a lot. And I don't actually think they're going to try that level of activity again. It was a little bridge. They get away with a lot, but that was a little bridge too far. And same with Hesketh and trying to blame the Admiral now and all of these kinds of things, at things that are clearly wrong. And then they're like, oh, we pushed it a bit too far. We'll try to walk it back a little bit. So I think, this has been the year of it being the wrong way around. People need to think before they act. And that's what, you're supposed to consult your lawyer before you do the thing. Not ask them to fix it afterwards. So I think that might be a moment that this year is remembered for, where we saw a lot of acts take place without any legal justification, and then a minor attempt to walk it back. And I'm sure Imogen could probably put a fantastically positive spin on that, because maybe that does say there is, and she's shaking her head, so I give up. Maybe there is just a little nub still of international law that we can place some hope in, that we will see some of these things get walked back, not many. But there's still something enough there that we haven't descended into complete anarchy. I hope that made sense. It's probably worth mentioning I was just handed a very large glass of Ntina Tzouvala, so I'm on to my third alcoholic beverage of the afternoon. So yes, things might get a little unclear from here on out.
Well, I think Juliette's just articulated the FAFO theory of international law. But one of the things I would actually build on from that, which I meant to give in reply to the last question, was that actually what we've often seen when states with serious capacity to project force abroad have acted with complete disregard for the rules is a belated realization that this is ultimately, to some extent, an act of self-harm, and that, wait a minute, maybe the rules are there not just to restrain us from acting out like a toddler, but because actually breaking these rules may have unintended consequences, and not in the someone will sue us before the ICJ, oh no version of the world, but actually long-term damage to our interests. And that's where lack of justification and that process of justification at least has the virtue of meaning you have to think these things through and have some, or at the very least, have some narrative in place for external and internal audiences about what the hell it is you're doing. Now, in terms of getting through the rest of this question with my sanity and optimism and will to live intact, and I note I've already taken off my braces and loosened my tie, so things are getting a bit edgy. I think I'm going to go with Dina, then Tamsin, then Imogen.
Right, that sounds wise. So I think it's relevant to what Doug and Juliette have been saying. For me, if I had to put it in one sentence, I would say it was a turning point, and I would say it was like the turn from rules and institutions to deals. That it seems that at least the US has a real preference currently for structuring international relations, and I would say especially international economic relations, through informal deals, non-binding, very highly personalized, like you do a deal with the president, who may or may not have domestic authority to do this deal anyway. These are not treaties at all. They don't have any institutions that can monitor and interpret and enforce things. And to me, that's a real turning point, not because I don't think that inherently an order based on rules is better. right? I don't think like rules can be extremely unjust, and by appearing as rules, they can also do an ideological work of appearing as neutral and good and like whatever. So I don't think this means that things were good and now things are bad. I think things were bad in a different way. And now things are bad in a different way, but also potentially worse, right? Because I do think like the seeming neutrality of rules can be ideologically misleading, but I think it also gives the opportunity to weaker actors to play with the rules, right? And turn the rules on their heads and like try to like win small battles against the more powerful party, etc. Whereas I feel this sort of like personalized and personal deals just simply don't have. Like, if they were treaties, which they're not, I would say they are unequal treaties in the proper 19th century sense of the word, but they are not even treaties. So to me, that's a real change. And it's even if you don't think it's a transition from something good and lovely to something bad, I think it's a real transition because at least for 30 years, and at least in the West, rules and the invocation of rules was a really important part of international politics, right? Like it was in the ideologically, if not practically, really important that we are supposedly the people who do things with rules. So when those in power stop doing that, for me, that's a real transition moment.
Tamsin.
Right, so I have flagged in the chat of Zoom that this is going to be pretty bleak, so refill your drinks, people. Um, no, not surprisingly, I come from a perspective of most of my stuff is on security and within the UN, but also within broader security concerns, be it conflict or just transnational organized crime. So I'm looking at it obviously through that lens, and I'm going to draw on something Dina said in our Resolution 2803 episode, which is the benefit of hypocrisy is that you can call out the hypocrite for being a hypocrite. You can't do that to a gangster. And I would say that what we're seeing now, building on Dina's comments, is that we don't have hypocrites anymore. We have just might makes right, gangsterism, and we've had dissatisfaction with the Security Council since the Security Council exists. But honestly, as someone who has read probably more Security Council history than anyone in the fucking world, I am genuinely terrified that we are seeing the end of the UN era of international law, and I don't know what's next. I don't know what comes next, and maybe this could be an opportunity for a renewal, but it very much, from a security perspective, looks like we are seeing the UN go the way of the League of Nations. And I'd really like to stop living in interesting times. Like, I'd just like to stop living in interesting times. I'd like to be able to be left alone to write about lore and fairy tales. But instead, you motherfuckers keep making me talk about how you are fucking idiots and ignoring international law and destroying every international institution that has at least pretended to provide some semblance of order to a world of violent chaos.
Imogen is hopefully going to save us from our depression in a moment, but I just wanted to jump in because this was the other thing I was thinking, right? That you've just articulated beautifully, but like it's giving 1922. I mean, we're literally at the, next version of the Palestinian Mandate, and the Security Council has,
and the return of actual fucking Nazis.
Like literally. And so I'm just, to almost certainly misquote Miranda Priestley, I'm feeling very like it's been done. Like, could we not? This is not neither new nor interesting. And could we do something different, please?
Florals for spring. How original.
How original. Like, could we not? But I don't know, maybe on a small note of hope to lead into our lovely Imogen, when at the first meeting of the United Nations, I'm sure you already know this, Tamsin, I can't remember who it was though, they said, the League is dead, long live the United Nations, the way that you pronounce, the king is dead, long live the king. Maybe we'll get another version that'll be even a little bit better again.
Oh yeah,
Maybe
look, this could be a moment of renewal. It could be, and I'm open to that possibility. I'd really like it to be. I don't have faith in that.
Okay, so I've been dubbed the resident optimist of the group, and so I'm going to start by letting you all down because I I actually really struggled to answer this question, and so I went to Google and I thought, well, I'll see what the UN has to say in terms of what are the themes of the year, what are the official UN themes of 2025, and it didn't really fill me with much hope because the first one is this is the International Year of Peace and Trust. I don't feel like we've done that very well.
Oops.
Oops. So the next one's got to be better, right? The next one, because there are often multiple international years of. The next one is this is the International Year of Glaciers Preservation.
I wish everyone could see the screen right now because we've lost Tamsin. She's gone. She's gone.
As my 13-year-old occasionally says, sort of with air quotes, like literally out loud, visible expression of concern.
So, in terms of the official international years of, we're not doing great. So then I thought, okay, what else is it the international year of? And I went to Chinese zodiac, and it's the International Year of the Snake. Now, what is the International Year of the Snake? What does the snake represent? It represents renewal and adaptation, shedding of what is bad, losing the skin, creating what is new. And I guess that's where my optimism comes in, is I do think we are at a point where, although forever it has been said the Security Council doesn't work, as Tamsin said, there's been questions about Security Council reform for as long as there's been a Security Council, I think we are getting to the point where it's becoming evident that there are some things about the United Nations system that aren't working anymore. And not just the main structures of the Security Council, but the World Trade Organization is pretty broken and looks to remain that way. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Here comes the optimist. Because I do think there will be a renewal. You only have to look around at all the themes of international law conferences this year, reconstructing international law, international law's future in uncertain times. Everyone's talking about what happens next and what's going to be recreated. And I don't think it's going to be a League of Nations to UN era type thing. I don't think it's going to be burn it all down and start again. But I do think there's going to have to be some serious reckoning with how we make it work. And I think we're starting to see the beginning of that with states, as we said in the first one, going around the system, using different ways to find solutions. And I think that's going to keep happening. And either those different solutions will work, such as the multi-party interim arbitration agreement in the WTO, and that will just become the new normal, or the different solutions will work so well that the states who are left out of it will say, well, actually, let's reform the original one because we don't like your alternate solution where you sidestepped us entirely. We want to be back in the picture and we'll do the reforms that make the original one work. So I think 2025 might be remembered as the year where the movement for change started becoming a bit more concrete. And I guess my note at the end is, if this is a sort of the United Nations is dead, long live the next installment, the United Nations, it's the 80th anniversary this year. And so it lasted about 4 times the length of the League of Nations. So as a maths nerd, if we continue that, we've got a 320-year period coming up of international regulation and glory. So maybe that's the bright note to end on.
Well, thank you, Imogen, for pulling us back from the brink. But reflecting on that whole discussion, I'm beginning to think that the Call to the Bar podcast should, like the International Law Commission or perhaps like Paddington Bear, have an annual yearbook. And the title could, for this year, could either be Gangsterism as International Law or just It's Giving 1922. Anyway, let's press on. So less existentially, it has in fact been a bumper year for the podcast. To give ourselves a bit of a pat on the back, we produced 26 episodes for season 1. And by the time we wrap up for 2025, we'll have completed 36 new episodes in season 2. We now have over 1,500 subscribers and over 43,000 plays on various platforms. So, wow, yay us. Anyway, my question for the panel, though, is what episode do you feel you've learned most from this year, or just learned interesting new things from? Who'd like to kick off? Right, I've got a competition of hands. I'll go with Dina first.
Sure, thank you. So I've never practiced international law, and I've practiced law very, very little. So I love hearing like war stories from practitioners. So I have to say, for me, the one I learned the most was episode 55, which is defending the defense, life on the other side of the courtroom. I believe it was Tamsin and Juliette speaking with Kate Gibson, who is an international criminal defense lawyer. And it's just, yeah, I always love hearing war stories, but it was also really nice to hear from a practitioner and somebody who's been in the thick of it, this thing that I've also been really uncomfortable about, which is how basically the imperative of ending impunity in ICL in international criminal law or through international criminal law has led into things like councils coping a lot of abuse, not enough money being given to defense lawyers. So that was really interesting to hear her account of what sort of distortions come in the international version of criminal law. To me, that was super, super interesting as an episode.
And also, I've got to say, I was absolutely gutted not to be on the panel for that episode, given that Kate Gibson counts as an old friend with whom I spent far too much time in the bars and pubs of Cambridge during our master's year. Tamsin.
Okay, so I'm going with a very different tact, but I'm a very good Protestant girl. And so I have made a point throughout my life of, not spending time learning about that damn fool heresy of the Catholics. So episode 40, which, as far as I'm aware, was Dina, Juliette, and Douglas on the Vatican and the Knights of Malta, blew my fucking mind about all of the crazy carry on there. And it's just confirmed that, yes, it's heresy, but it's really interesting heresy, and I kind of want to know more.
Fabulous.
You stole my episode. I was going to say that one. I learned I was going to cheat and have two, so it's a good thing I've got a backup. But so I learned, in terms of just stuff I did not know previously, it was probably that episode, and I think actually also the piracy episode. I can't remember the number, but where you and Doug explained piracy to me for the first time, I was genuinely blown away by that. But in terms of my pick, I'm actually going to say it was episode 51 with Tamsin and Rob McLaughlin and Alonso Gomendi, where I learned a lot, not in terms of stuff I didn't know from a legal perspective, but more about how the history and context and how taking a critical approach to some of these rules can really open up a different perspective on them. And so as someone who's maybe kind of the opposite of Dina, who is always very much a practitioner and still kind of has that practitioner mindset, that episode for me was really great because I listened to it in preparation for a news interview I was doing. And, I knew this was going to come up because it was a recent thing. And I was like, oh, it'll just help me to get across, the basic law stuff. In the end, I basically used none of it, but it really just blew my mind open in terms of the way that, understanding the colonial history of law and all of this stuff really gives you insights into the power relationships that lie behind a lot of this and the way that, law is an active ongoing conversation that we need to be having about what kind of a world we want to be living in. So yeah, that's my pick of episodes for the year.
Imogen.
So I have two, and they both involve judges, and they both involve Juliette, actually. So the first is episode 52, which was Dina, Juliette, and Victor Catton, looking at recusal, impartiality, and judicial ideology at the ICJ. I am a bit of an ICJ statute nerd, but I'm nowhere on Juliette's level. And so I just love that episode because having it all set out for me and explained and learning about recusal was fantastic. And I just found it really, really interesting. The other one was back at the very beginning of the year, which was episode 29, with Juliette, Mike Becker, and Kyra Weigard, which was judges behaving badly, plagiarism and ethics at international courts. Now, both of them featured the same judge, I should say. Again, really interesting, really contemporary. In that one, some very interesting discussions about what is plagiarism and what isn't, particularly in the judicial setting. I remember back when I did practice 20 years ago, that pleadings, this is domestically, pleadings I wrote for a case, a paragraph appeared word for word in a judgment, with no attribution, of course, because that's not what judges do. And at the time, my principal said to me, you should be really pleased. You know, you drafted our pleadings well enough that the judge took your words and used them, which is great, except it's nothing you can point to subsequently and say, you know, hey, I did this bit of the judgment's mine. So just that idea that there is this sort of different standard of plagiarism to an extent that's accepted in the legal profession that we wouldn't ever accept in academia, I think is really interesting. But I also wanted to give a shout out to Mike Becker, because even though it was, I'm pretty sure, morning in Ireland, he nonetheless rocked up to the podcast with a whiskey, which I just thought was very funny. So I enjoyed that episode.
A whiskey called, if I remember, Writer's Tears.
Yes. Writer's
For
Tears.
which,
We just want to try.
all the points, Mike, if you're listening, all the points to you. So I don't escape this question either. And look, it's been a rich year. There's a lot to choose from. And we've covered, for obvious reasons, the question of Palestine a great deal on this podcast. But I felt I got a lot out of episode 54, Recognition of the United Nations and the Question of Palestine, in which Dina interviewed Adi Imses. And there was a combination there of doctrinal law, history, and critical approaches that I took a lot out of. But also, I mean, that the erasure of Palestine as a concept is so foundational to the UN system was a bit jarring, right? Like that the critical case on the legal personality of the UN itself, the reparations case, arises entirely from a factual context in Palestine, which is not mentioned. And I mean, the metaphor there is both sort of compelling and terrible, but also the extent to which Adi was, how to put it, he wouldn't have cast himself in these terms, but I'll put it this way: a highly pragmatic optimist. In terms of some of the themes we've discussing, you know, when you have no other tools left, law might be the only tool available, and that is not completely without value, not because it's magically going to achieve everything, but because, for example, the holdouts on the recognition of Palestine, being the Western states we're most familiar with, including the one we're sitting in, it won't necessarily be completely legally empty that they have engaged in recognition, that it ultimately does begin to affect either the internal logic of the state or provide further kind of chinks in the armor, opportunities for creative lawyering, and that sense that, yes, we live in a bleak, unjust, and very often racist world, but that law might give us a ratchet where we can slowly move things in one direction, and that direction is hopefully closer to justice. Right, so that was a half bleak, half optimistic question, or response to my own question, which leads me towards wrapping up. So in wrapping up, something hopefully lighter. For Australians, the summer break approaches, except for Tamsin, who teaches the summer semester. Nonetheless, panel, what are we hoping to read, watch, listen to, or otherwise turn to forget international law for whatever form of summer break we're going to get? Or indeed, what are our holiday plans for culture or travel? Who'd like to start?
So my summer plans always involve reading, essentially. I find it hard during semester to read as much as I would like to for pleasure, because I read so much for work that I find that bit of my brain sometimes gets a bit full. And I really enjoy reading fiction, and I just don't do as much of it as I'd like. So I tend to just go on a mega fiction bomb during summer. And I'd love to tell you the titles of what I'm going to read, but I can't, Because at the beginning of this year, I had a bright idea where you know those books you can get that they wrap in brown paper and it's like choose a mystery date with a book that some bookstores do. So I went through my bookshelf in January this year and I picked 12 books that I'd been meaning to read but haven't. And I wrapped them all up in brown paper and I numbered them 1 to 12. And my idea was that we would roll a dice every month and I would read one at random. And I told myself if I didn't like it, then that was it. I didn't have to finish it, but I'd at least give it a go and then I could pass it on. I've read 2. I got to February with this plan and then it all fell apart. So my idea is I'm taking the remaining 10 in their brown paper wrapping away with me and I'm going to attempt to at least start them all. And if I don't like them, I'm going to leave them at various free libraries on the South Coast as I go, leaving a trail of books in my wake.
What an absolutely delightful idea. And if you can't get your phone to simulate a D10, I'm sure I can lend you one. Who's next? Dina.
So I'm going to continue from last episode's theme, my Korean shows. On the 16th of December, the second season of Culinary Class Wars is dropping. Juliette is, yes, and Imogen. So it is a cook show made by Korean TV, but as it implies, there is a weird class element, which is different contestants have different levels of seniority, but also different budgets. So like you have to make the same dish and some people have like $1,000 and some people have 10. So you have to like make the best that you can with what you have. And I love it. And I can't wait for it to be out. Again, as all good Korean TV, 2-hour long episodes. They don't care if you can concentrate. You should concentrate. That's your problem. And what I'm reading, which is not exactly a light and fun beach read, but it is really good, is a journalistic book by a US journalist called Jacob Silverman called Gilded Rage, Elon Musk and the Radicalization of Silicon Valley. And it is amazing. It does what it says in the cover about like the right-wing pivot of Silicon Valley the last few years. It's about Elon Musk, it's about Peter Thiel, but because it's written by a journalist, it's an amazing page turner. And it's a terrible reminder of how bad academics write, included myself.
Tamsin.
So, as been noted, I am teaching over the summer trimester, so I'll be interspersing my breaks in between dealing with student emails for both international law at an undergrad and JD level and ethics at a JD level. So that'll be tons of fun. But I also have tournament season in golf coming up. So I am a disabled golfer and we have a whole bunch of major tournaments going. So I have the Vic Open and potentially 3 small field invitational ones alongside the WebEx professional events in Australia over summer. So they'll be really exciting. And beyond that, mostly just planning to keep reading at the moment. I'm reading through the Susan novels in the Discworld series. I'm about halfway through The Hogfather. So I'll clear up Thief of Time after that and then see where it takes me.
Wonderful.
Nice.
Juliette.
So I would normally spend my summers at a local Adelaide beach on my stand-up paddleboard, but of course a certain algal bloom has put those plans to bed. So I am probably just going to like rot. That is my summer plan. And I don't know if it's I'd love to say I'm going to read something highbrow, but the honest answer is I'm probably just going to be on AO3 reading fan fiction. But I do actually have a genuine book recommendation because I have, rather like Imogen, I struggle to read during the course of the year. And I've read almost nothing, and I have forced myself through this absolutely charming book, which does not deserve to be forced through on any rational basis. It's lovely. And I think people would really enjoy it if they are looking for a summer read. It is called Summer at Mount Asama. It's by Masashi Matsui. It's a Japanese novel. And it's literally about a group of architects who are in a competition to design the new National Library of Japan. And like a lot of wonderful Japanese books, it is just very, I don't know how to describe it. It's very small. right? You have detailed descriptions of fireflies and little things and birds and little things that are happening at this house that they're all staying at. And it's just really regulating and really beautiful. So I would recommend that if people are looking for a summer read. I've really enjoyed it. Yes, and if anyone has any AO3 authors they want to send my way, they can do that as well.
Fabulous. Thank you, Juliette.
What are you doing, Doug?
Well, this has been my year of learning to sew, and I've literally this afternoon, my big 50th birthday present arrived, which is a brand new Janome heavy-duty sewing machine, which will be much better for garment making. So I plan to get a start on my autumnal wardrobe early, if I possibly can, over summer. Also, yes, love reading, love graphic novels, and re-engaging with my childhood love of Doctor Who recently, and bringing all of those things together. I recently bought a giant discounted humble bundle of Doctor Who comics, which I'm having an iPad repaired in the hope of being able to take them in an actually usable medium to the beach. And the beach for me is 2 weeks in January on the New South Wales south coast at Tathra, which I'm very much looking forward to.
I love
And
that you and Imogen are doing the most stereotypical Canberra things ever and going to the coast. It's peak Canberra.
It is peak Canberra, but it's also peak Australian in a sense, right? You know, you get to summer and you have to hit the beach. Imogen?
I'm aware of that, but the coast in particular is a peak Canberra activity.
It's true. It's true.
I'm doing three coasts this summer. We're doing South Coast, New Zealand coast, and Western Australia. So
Wow.
I'm just summer of the beaches.
Melissa and I are doing our coast trip at the start of autumn, so you know.
Lovely. Okay. Well,
Douglas,
everyone...
before we go,
yes,
you need to tell our listeners what you are wearing for this recording.
Right. So I've made a bit of a point about the fact that I've loosened my tie, but today it was a bit cooler in Canberra, not as cold as Monday. So I've been wearing green cord trousers, a white shirt with a reasonably thick mid-blue stripe, a vintage Kenzo paisley tie of I think the mid-90s, and bright blue braces. I also earlier had on a window check green wool jacket in a lovely herringbone with.
You're also clothed in violence for referring to the mid-90s as vintage.
I don't make the rules, Tamsin. They're just there. As a good positivist, the rules are just there. I'm just applying them to the facts. All right, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us. There'll be one more episode of season 2, and then we'll see you in God Help Us All 2026 for season 3. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I need to go as well. See you soon, guys.
See you soon.